the 16-bit era was said and done, the Sega Genesis offered very few RPGs when compared to its chief competitor, the SNES. However, some developers made a candid effort to bring the genre to the system, even though some of those titles became quite overshadowed. One example was Shining Force, which came out in North America in March of 1992. It was a sister game of sorts to Shining in the Darkness, a first-person dungeon crawler RPG that preceded it. In contrast to Shining in the Darkness, Shining Force is a tactical RPG. It's perhaps one of the most significant ones too, because many of its game mechanics preceded and influenced later games, such as Dare Langrisser, Tactics Ogre, the Fire Emblem games, and Final Fantasy Tactics. Shining Force was a real innovator because it was one of the first RPGs I can think of that used a grid-oriented system for combat. Each unit occupies a square, can move a fixed amount of spaces, and can take one action per turn. In addition, taking actions gives experience points that allow characters to level up. Each unit has a particular class that defines their strengths, weaknesses, and which abilities they have. Also, battles usually require you to kill all enemies or kill an enemy leader. Every single one of these characteristics were utilized in strategy games of all kinds for the next 20 years, so it's pretty impressive that many of them found their beginnings here. Unlike many of the other strategy titles though, actual battle actions play out on a separate screen. This applies not only to attacks against enemies, but also to things like healing abilities for your own party members. Personally, I love the way this worked. The screen transitions made Shining Force feel like it just had so much more depth than some of the other games of its kind. The fact that you could also see equipped weapons was also an aspect that was way ahead of its time. The battle animations were actually very well done for the time too, and feature sprites and effects that are much larger than many other 16-bit counterparts. Again, this is pretty impressive for 1992. The game's story takes place in the kingdom of Guardiana, in the land of Rune. The player assumes the role of Max, who is sent to prevent an evil lord from opening the Shining Path and resurrecting the Dark Dragon. In the process of this quest, he meets several companions and recruits them to join the Shining Force. It's nothing too out of the norm for a fantasy RPG, but I do have to say that Graf from Xenogears looked a lot like Dark Soul, the lead antagonist in this one. But either way, the flavor and art style were on point for the type of game it was, and it fit the story perfectly. Another aspect of Shining Force I absolutely have to cover is its promotion system. This feature allows your characters to grow in power through a class transition that functions a bit similarly to Seiken Densetsu 3/Trials of Mana. In this one, once you get to level 10, you can promote a character to the more advanced class of his or her archetype by visiting a priest. For instance, the knight becomes a paladin, the swordsman becomes a hero, the mage becomes a wizard, and the priest becomes a vicar. A promotion will alter your character's stats and bring them back to level 1, but doing so will opt to make them a lot more powerful than they were before. The promotion system was a fun method to customize your experience with the game, and made it unlike that of others without this type of advancement. The promotion system was also incorporated into almost all other Shining Force games that came after it, and it was a characteristic that fans of the series really remember fondly. The soundtrack is decent, but I don't think it quite touches the greatness of the best SNES RPG soundtracks. Its composer, Masahiko Yoshimura, also did the soundtrack of Shining in the Darkness, and it adopts a similar style. The grindy Genesis sound chip just wasn't my cup of tea, but even with the limitations of the hardware, he did the best he could to put fantasy music onto the Genesis. The system just wasn't made for it. Shining Force takes about 35 hours to beat, making it one of the longest games on the Genesis. That's pretty impressive, as it makes it one of the most ambitious games on the system. I also think the power curve was handled pretty well too. The game isn't insanely difficult like some other tactical RPGs, but it isn't ridiculously easy either as long as you don't grind for levels. I do think Shining Force does have a few annoyances though. One is that there's an audible sound whenever there's scrolling text, and there's no way I know of to turn it off, so that can be frustrating if you prefer silent text. The other issue, which is even more maddening, is that inventory management is a true pain. Shining Force certainly isn't alone in this era when it comes to that, but each character can only hold a small number of items. It just consumes a lot of time. Ugh. The development team of Climax and Sonic Software Planning united to create a really great game in Shining Force. It was a truly fun experience, especially in the time it came out. It is more gameplay oriented than it is story oriented, but the interface is easy to use and the battles run pretty smooth. You won't feel bored playing this game. You can still find the original Genesis cart today, but it's not that cheap, relatively speaking at least. At the time of this recording, loose copies go from about $50 to $75. However, it was included in the Sega Genesis mini console, which is a great way to play it now. The best option is probably to pick it up on Steam though, as it's only 99 cents. Thankfully, there's lots of ways to go back and give this one a try if you missed out on it back in the day. There's a few characteristics of Shining Force I don't love, but it still holds up now and is worth playing today. It featured a solid fantasy story, fun and innovative combat, and great gameplay. It's one of those titles that Genesis-owning RPG fans could point to and say, "See, we told you the system has something to offer us." Maybe it was all that blast processing that allowed it to do what Nintendo don't, if you remember that marketing campaign. For my money, Shining Force is one of the best games on the Sega Genesis, period, and it really stands out above nearly every other RPG on the system. If you enjoy many of the games I cover, I think you'll enjoy this one too. Let me know in the comments what you think about Shining Force if you love the game. If you haven't played it, let me know what seems interesting about it to you. Please like and subscribe to my channel for more retro gaming content, join my Discord community linked in the description, and consider supporting my channel via YouTube's Join feature to receive member exclusives.